Emerald tears. Metallic feet stepped onward, grinding the bodies of fallen Necron warriors beneath their heels. They advanced up the rising slope of the ancient roadway, climbing toward the high road with mechanical inevitability. The clang of metal on stone became an unending rhythm, a cold, relentless percussion that sounded less like marching soldiers and more like the internal workings of some vast and uncaring machine. They moved in absolute silence, no battle cry, no word of command, only the ceaseless chittering of servos and the hollow drumbeat of their footfalls. Green balefire burned within skeletal eye sockets as they marched, rank upon rank, the eerie glow reflected on polished bronze and corroded iron. Sea rot still clung to some of them, barnacles fused to breastplates, kelp fibers trailing from rib cages, remnants of centuries entombed beneath the ocean. Their gaze never shifted. Each skull visage was locked upon the enemy ahead, deathless and emotionless, their hatred older than empires. The phalanx of the Iron King ascended the road like a rising tide of living metal, a silent storm of bronze, brass, and emerald fire, advancing to claim the causeway in their name. A nest of heavy bolters opened fire, cutting into the advancing ranks, but the concentrated Gauss fire found them in turn. Their defensive bastion was torn apart, the sandcrete walls burning under a wash of green light. The sergeant, realizing the danger, ordered a withdrawal. But before the squad could fall back, the wall behind them collapsed in a gout of energy. The entire position was swallowed in a flood of emerald beams. The first Necron reached the barricade at the road's edge. A Gastelm rose to meet it, firing from the hip, but a Gauss flash sheared through his pauldron, turning his armor to bubbling metal. He staggered, dropped his bolter, and drew his pistol with his remaining hand. The Necron brought down its glowing axe, only for Scop Wolfgar to appear in a blur of motion. The chaplain's Crozius cracked the air with a thunderclap, obliterating the Xeno's head in a burst of light and molten fragments. The wounded Gastelm, half his armor smoking, returned to the line, firing with grim resolve, pistol steady in one hand. Wolfgar turned on the next cluster of metallic forms scaling the rubble heap. His voice thundered through his vox, a litany forged in the forge of faith. For the lands the human eye may gaze upon are man's forever. 2 warriors fell to his plasma pistol, the weapon glowing like a star in his fist. Those who covet the throne, he roared, fall in thrice-damned shame. 2 Gastelms were struck down beside him, one consumed in searing green light, the other crushed beneath collapsing stone. Wolfgar charged forward, cleaving a Necron in 2 with a single crushing blow, his Crozius leaving arcs of fire in the smoke. He shot 2 more before turning to the Astartes along the line. It was time. The enemy before them was still far too numerous for their grand plan to succeed, but the line was buckling, and that was enough. He still had cards yet unplayed, a runesmith and Hearthguard lying in wait, and the 10th captain with his mad folly clutched close to his breast. But now was not the moment to unleash any of them. He had Captain Sigabield, of course, positioned halfway between his own place upon the raised high road bisecting the necropolis, and 2nd Captain Toonbald, who waited with his chosen squad atop the turnpike, guarding the causeway's entrance onto the main road. A foolish and wasted posting, Wolfgar knew. No Necron would be so witless as to attempt an ascent there, and he silently cursed losing 4 Astartes to the rebellious captain's paranoia. Their bolters were needed here, in the Crucible. That left him only one card to play, one that would not reveal his hand to the enemy. He switched to the Fleet Vox, issued the command in a single clipped code phrase, then stepped back into the melee, smashing another Necron skull beneath the energized head of his Crozius. The metallic cranium cracked like brittle stone, green light guttering out as the skeletal machine collapsed. Around him the air shimmered with heat, Gauss fire shrieked above the battlements, and the night-black banners of the Void Revenants snapped in the necropolis wind. Fagward, Wolfgar breathed, setting his stance as the bronze tide pressed closer. The next phase of the battle had begun. Up on the flat-topped pyramid overlooking the high road, the Void armsmen huddled low, heads ducked behind fallen statues and broken plinths. Above them, the 10th Company scouts of the Void Revenants observed the battle like hunters on a cliff. The sniper among them picked off officers and overseers with surgical precision. Inside the shadowed doorway of a half-collapsed crypt, Vox-Tech Ordmer crouched, with his headset pressed tight, listening as squad channels crackled with target relays. Wolfgar's order came over the Voxnet, calm, unbroken, resolute. Ordmer did not flinch. He could not see the chaplain, but he knew the moment the Lin faltered. He set his jaw. He placed the Vox transmitter down, slung his missile launcher across his shoulder, and climbed out of the crypt, clawing his way up the cracked escarpment to the roof. He approached Void Officer Hālgengas and spoke quietly, voice hoarse with dust and smoke. The chaplain sent the command. Hālgengas looked at him. She pushed up her cap. Her eyes were red with sand, smoke, and exhaustion. But there was something else there, too, a fire Ordmer hadn't seen in all their years together. She nodded, took up her rifle, gave the hand sign to the scouts, and descended the plinth. The Void armsmen saw her coming. They tapped one another's shoulders, lifted their weapons, braced themselves. She looked over the carnage below. The Void Revenants were being overrun, line buckling, ground disappearing beneath a tide of metal and green fire. She looked back at Ordmer and smiled, a smile he had never seen on her face before. Then she leapt forward into the fray. On the defense line, Wolfgar hacked into 3 Necrons as they vaulted the shattered wall. One fell, but the other 2 raised their weapons at point-blank range. Wolfgar snarled and fired his plasma pistol into both of their brass-plated kneecaps. As they toppled, his Crozius pulped their necks with a single hammering blow. 10 paces, he roared, and the call rippled down the line. The Astartes fell back 10 strides across the wide roadway, dropping into the broken siding. A heartbeat later, the Necron host climbed the ruins of their barricade, metallic feet clambering unhindered, silhouettes cut stark against the green glow of the necropolis beyond. And then, fire, Hālgengas commanded. The Void armsmen unleashed disciplined fury, lasfire and Serpenta bursts hammering the advancing rank. Grenades sailed over the parapet, detonating in blossoms of plasma and fragmentation. Bronze limbs flew. Skulls burst like overpressurized glass. Hālgengas vaulted over the crouched Astartes, leading her crew into the breach with bayonets and chain blades, finishing the few Necrons still standing. The battlefield became a tangle of shattered brass, fused limbs, and bodies that could not teleport away because they were welded together by their own dead. All of it stank of burnt seaweed, ozone, and wet metal. The Necron warriors advanced in renewed waves, clambering over the shattered stones of the high road. Their metal feet clanged on fused brass bones and broken flagstones, each step sending a rain of grit and spent shell casings down the embankment. Their expressions were blank, skull-visaged, and silent, the green light in their eye sockets burning like cold malice. Wolfgar crushed one of the metallic skeletons beneath his boot, blasting a second apart with his plasma pistol. The line was buckling again. He raised his Crozius high in warning, and then a cry cut through the roar of Gauss and bolter fire. "Figured!" Hālgengas and her Void armsmen vaulted the parapet like a breaking tide. They hit the Necron warriors with the fury of the damned, chain blades and Seek's knives screaming through the air. These were not panicked militia. These were survivors of the Olgarith War, the Drukhari slave pits, and the chaos rampage of Trinova. Void-born killers forged in the dark, where one mistake meant an unmarked grave. The Necrons had once fought gods in the war in heaven. They knew nothing of these mortals. "Welsiacs!" roared another group, their voices cracking with hate. The name of their lost ship, stolen, torn from the void by this very Xenos race. Now the word meant only vengeance. Gauss weapons were hacked from skeletal hands. Seek's blades of Skyfall metal forged to pierce Xenos hides sank into necrodermis with sickening cracks, splitting bronze and iron like rotted bone. Voidsmen wrenched Necron warriors off their feet and hurled them over the parapet, bodies tumbling like scrap metal down into the advancing ranks below. One Voidsman jammed his boarding pike into a Necron's chest and levered it upward, toppling the machine over the edge. Another emptied an entire clip of crack shot into a warrior's face, sending its skull skittering across the road like a kicked helm. They fought shoulder to shoulder with the Astartes, their boots slick with oil, coolant, and blood. Ordmer stood at Hālgengas' side, helmet cracked, bandaged skull oozing through the gauze, one eye wild with battle fury. He steadied his last fragmentation rocket, whispered a curse, and fired. The explosion tore a chunk out of the embankment and hurled dozens of Necrons down the slope like dead stars. Smoke washed over them. The Necron wave faltered. Harrijith planted her blood-slick boot on the parapet and looked down upon the chaos she had wrought. Her chain blade sputtered with enemy gore. "We've taken the wall," she shouted, voice hoarse. "The rest is on you, chaplain." Wulfgar raised his Crozius in salute, the weapon dripping molten Xenos metal. "So be it," he growled, and the Void Revenants roared again, like the dead dragged screaming back into battle. "Back!" Her command cut the smoke like a whip. The Void troops withdrew in disciplined bounds, racing to their original positions while Wulfgar's warriors surged forward. The Void Revenants, having snatched a moment to rearm and regroup, returned to the defense line, snapping back into formation like a closing jaw. The second Necron assault had failed, but as Wulfgar watched, more metallic bodies marched forward. The broken dragged away, others phasing out for repair, and still more advanced, bronzed feet clanging on stone. Wulfgar raised his Crozius and shouted to his brothers, "Choose your targets!" The battle was far from over. Godric waded through the retreating Voidsmen like a walking fortress of iron and wrath, each step shaking the ground. His dreadnought frame loomed above them, draped in dripping seawater, his armor scored with radioactive gouges from a dozen Gauss strikes. Beside him, Cuthum looked absurdly small, his robes plastered to him like wet parchment, staff clutched tightly in both hands. Another emerald beam slammed into Godric's chest. His refractor field flared, rippling like white fire as it absorbed the blast. The dreadnought let out something that might once have been laughter, a booming, static-laced bellow that echoed off the stone walls. "Ha! That tickled!" He swung his armored bulk, twin autocannons roaring, blowing apart a Gauss emplacement set behind a broken archway. The cannon crew vanished in a storm of shredded bronze and boiling metal. With a thunderous crash, Godric hauled himself up the breached defense wall, stonework cracking under his adamantium heels. Beyond, the enemy lines were in disarray. Necron phalanxes were reforming, trampled by their own advancing ranks, struggling to climb over mangled bodies fused together like slagged sculpture. Godric flexed his colossal fist around the haft of his storm axe. "No time to let the Xenos find order in chaos, little brother," he boomed. Cuthelm sighed, soaked and furious, shaking spectral water from his staff. "No wonder you ended up in a sarcophagus with that attitude," he muttered. Godric did not wait for a reply. He leapt. It was less of a heroic jump and more of a catastrophic fall. Gravity and sheer tonnage carried him straight into the Necron line. He landed like a meteor strike, stone shattered under him, bodies launched skyward, and his axe came down, cleaving a lich guard in two like wet parchment. The impact rang through the cavern like a temple bell. Cuthum steadied himself against the shockwave, then grinned despite himself. Raising his staff, he unleashed a torrent of crackling warp fire. Blue witch flame poured through the gaps Godric carved, turning Necron warriors into screaming silhouettes of molten bronze. Behind him, Gastelm and the surviving Astartes roared their battle cry as they charged, "Fegwerd!" The dreadnought's laughter mixed with the howl of the warp and the clash of metal on metal as the Void Revenants fell like a hammer upon the doomed legion of iron. Wulfgar stood above it all, overseeing the rapid rebuilding of the parapet. The Fifth Company worked quickly, earning their nickname, the Siege Company, even here, in a tomb where no imperial citadel was meant to stand. Osric took position beside him, his mechadendrite-mounted Melta flicking between targets while his plasma pistol barked bursts of superheated light. "Don't learn, do they?" he grunted, burning down another climbing machine. "They don't have to learn," Wulfgar replied, reloading. "They only need to keep coming. We're running out of ammunition." Below them, the Necron line buckled again, jammed by their own dead, Godric's rampage scattering their formations. Blocked, crushed, toppling into one another like a broken conveyor system, their phalanxes tangled and stalled. Osric scowled. "We're buying time, nothing more. Look there, those tripods and spires above the necropolis? That's not a vanguard. That's a population. We don't have the numbers, Wulfgar. I don't see your strategy." Wulfgar's skull helm turned toward him, lenses cold. "Drain them, hold them, force them all to face us here. When the necropolis is empty, when every path is pointed at us." Horrorwolf can deliver the chalice and end this war. Osric scoffed. Still chasing myth and prophecy. A relic, a runesmith, a hearthguard, and 2 bikers hiding under a roof. That's your end of war? Wolfgar chambered a fresh round. Godric was returning uphill, the Gastelm reforming around him. I'm not playing dice, Osric, he said. Osric raised his axe, pointing toward the advancing enemy once more. Then what are you playing? Cards, Wolfgar replied. Osric shook his head. I don't think the enemy is much for games. By the next attack we'll be fighting with seeks and fist. The men are down to their last rounds, Osric growled. Which card do you have to solve that problem? I don't know, came the smooth voice of Deacon Absalon. But Wolfgar is rather good with the Emperor's tarot. I suspect cards are his forte. Thank you, Wolfgar muttered dryly. At least someone still has faith. Osric shrugged, wiping a smear of coolant from his armor. Speak for yourself, Deacon. I'm certain the good Scop is favored far more than I at games of chance. He peered again toward the advancing enemy. The defensive line fell silent as both Astartes turned their helm lenses toward the Deacon, standing openly, leaning on his staff, a cheerful expression on his face as though this were a quiet chapel ceremony. What are you doing here? Wolfgar demanded. Took the words out of my mouth, Osric added. You were supposed to be on your way to the surface for warm milk and a bath, not back here on the front line. Absalon nodded as if the accusation were praise. I thought my services would be better placed here, he replied serenely. Besides, I met a few friends. Thought you needed them. As he spoke, Astartes in fresh, unscarred armor emerged from the drowned streets behind them. Wading through waist-deep water came 8th Captain Phaon and 6th Captain Sigibert, leading their reserve companies. Phaon saluted sharply and led his assault troops along the left flank. Sigibert raised his power axe in salute to Wolfgar and Osric before guiding his warriors to the right. Within moments the parapet, almost empty minutes before, bristled with bolters, flamers, and fresh ceramite. The exhausted warriors of the 5th and 2nd Companies clasped gauntlets with their brothers. Wounded were dragged back by Wurtweirds, while those still able quickly briefed the newcomers on the enemy assault routes and the hidden passages between mastabas where Necron skirmishers had been attempting to flank them. Osric exhaled heavily and tipped his helm toward Wolfgar. An apology is in order, Wolfgar nodded, raising his bolt pistol toward the new wave of skeletal forms below. Thank the Deacon, now fire! Las, Bolter, and Melta roared in unison, scourging the advancing Xenos ranks in a storm of holy flame. Osric tore the spent plasma pack from his gun, tossing the burned-out coil aside. A runesmith bearing the sigil of the 8th Company handed him a fresh weapon. He snapped it into place and muttered under his breath, although this still won't be enough. He fired into the massed horde crawling up the ridge. No drums, no horns, no shouted orders, only the sound of metal feet grinding against stone and the slow, awful hum of Gauss coils building to charge. Rank upon rank of Necrons moved through the drowned streets below, climbing over the fused wreckage of their own dead, eyes burning like drowned lanterns in the dark. Bronze skulls and barnacle-crusted limbs scraped over broken masonry, advancing with the inevitability of a falling star. Upon the ridge, bolters clicked empty. Plasma coils overheated. Even the Astartes paused a half-second between shots, gauging the foe. Into that breathless moment, the Deacon stepped forward. His robes were torn, scorched with ozone burns. His reliquary box dangled at his side like a haloed bomb. He tapped his staff against the stone and spoke, voice amplified by the vox spirits of his armor. Stand, children of the Emperor! Your faith is the shield no Xenos may pierce. Behind him, the floodwaters swelled, then broke as shadows emerged. Soldiers in ragged trench coats, half-drowned and bloodied, pulling heavy weapon carriages behind them. Fraterus militia, the survivors the Deacon had led to safety, had returned. But these were changed. Their autocannons were no longer bare machines of steel. They were covered in wax seals and painted sigils, dripping with oil of benediction. On the barrels, golden script spelled the names of martyred saints. The guns glowed faintly with incense smoke, as though the machine spirits themselves inhaled the prayers. One militiaman lifted the autocannon's ready flag, now painted with a gilt image of St. Cassin's burning eyes. For Welsiax, the militia roared. Fege word, answered the Void Armsman atop the ridge. The Astartes were momentarily silent, then bellowed as one. "For the Emperor!" The deacon raised his staff. "Loose holy fire." The autocannons barked, not with muzzle flare, but with consecrated fury. The shells struck the advancing Necron wall like thunder on a cathedral bell. Bronze heads ruptured, steel torsos flared with molten fractures, shattering into phosphorescent dust. What Gauss weapons survived returned fire, green beams searing the air, but the newly anointed gun carriages held. Their armor blistered under the energy wash, but did not break. Holy seals burned away like parchment, fulfilling their purpose. Above them, Astartes answered with bolter and blade. Plasma rockets streaked down the road, leaving contrails of blue-white fire. Oversized melta-charges, hurled like grenades, burst into sun-hot flowers, melting entire squads into puddles of screaming liquid metal. Wolfgar's Crozius crackled with pale lightning as he pointed toward the mass. "They weaken! Hold them here! Drain them dry!" Osric stood shoulder to shoulder with him, his mechadendrite-mounted melta roaring one moment, a plasma burst the next. "They are learning, Scop," he muttered as he burned a charging Necron to slag, too slowly. From below, the Necron ranks faltered, not out of fear, but because the bodies piled too quickly to cross. They began climbing over their own dead, limbs forcing through fused torsos, Gauss barrels pressing through rotting seaweed and shattered skulls. The deacon drew a battered bolt pistol and crossed himself once. "Let them come," he whispered. "Let them choke on their own eternity." The ridge erupted again in fire. Herjith watched as the sons of Nitwertha fought side by side, the hulking Astartes of the Void Revenants alongside the Frateris militia and Wigathane warriors, the banner of Broad Muthiport snapping above them. Mag shields locked together into a crude shield wall, and electro-charged javelins arced through the subterranean gloom, shattering Necron warriors with crackling bolts of witch lightning. She smiled. "Look at that." Ordmer, seated once more with his Vox unit pressed to his ear, glanced over just long enough to catch the scene. "I see it," he muttered, slumping back down. "Surprised the Fishermen's Guild haven't shown up. Everyone else has." Herjith frowned. She watched a wolf sword unleash a trio of wargs against a section of the wall the Necrons had crested. The beasts tore metal limbs from torsos in an instant, hurling bodies from the ramparts. The gassed helm of the Fifth Company saluted the wolf sword as the wargs returned to their master for the next kill, and the Astartes poured fire down the secured battlement. "No Mechanicus," she muttered dryly. "I'd have thought Tiberius would be in on this by now." Ordmer looked up from the Vox dials. "No Mechanicus messages, their wavebands dark." He glanced up at the cavern roof lost in mineral shadow. "I suppose Vox can't get through this deep underground. Doubtless the Mechanicus are tending surface defenses." A cold thought crossed his face. "Or getting ready to blow the tunnels. Seal us down here if we lose." A drop of water struck his cheek. Another touched his hand. One rolled off his helmet. He sighed, pulled a rain cover from his pack, and draped it over the Vox unit. "Rain, all we needed," he muttered. Above them, the sniper fired again. Herjith looked up. The 10th Company spotter scratched another line into the wall beside him. 57 Necron warrior kills, 9 officers, 1 lord. She smiled. At least someone was keeping tally. Rain splashed against her face, and she lowered her splash visor. All Voidsmen had one. Their homeworld was nothing but rain. Then the thought struck her. Why is it raining? She didn't voice it. Something flashed in the distance. Silver, fast-moving. She rose a little higher, peering out toward the far end of the road they defended, toward the direction of the causeway. She tapped the Astartes scout beside her for a scope. Without taking his eyes off his next target, a Necron officer bearing a grim green war scythe, he handed her a spare rangefinder. She sighted along it. The causeway ran along the drowned edge of the vast cavern, mostly flooded, but rising to meet the road they held. The water churned, rippling unnaturally. At first, she assumed discharge from pumping station sluices. Then she saw metal, a skeletal ribcage of iron rising up from the water, full of tiny green lights, eyes, Necron eyes. Another transport burst from below the surface, then another. More and more rose, a whole column of ribcage skimmercraft packed with warriors, racing up the incline toward the ridge. Her mouth went dry. She wiped the rain from her face and looked again. Fast, armored, loaded. They were coming for the road. She dropped down behind the wall. "Call the chaplain! Emergency override!" she barked. Ordmare looked horrified. "What? They'll kill me if I'm lucky?" "Do it!" The rain came harder, lit by the eerie Necron light looking like emerald tears falling over the battlefield. Down below, Wulfgar stood blasting into the metal tide. Beside him, Cuthhelm stalked, hurling spectral fire into the advancing ranks. His Vox crackled to life. Priority override. He switched channels, listened, and his weapon arm dropped as the news hit. He stepped back from the parapet, closing his eyes. He had been wrong. He had treated this war like a game of cards, saving resources for the perfect trick, holding back plays, calculating his moment. He had forgotten the one truth that mattered. The enemy played cards too, and now those cards were being laid on the table. A force was driving down on them that could take the road from the far side. He could not fight a two-front war, and the only thing out there holding that flank was Captain Toonbald and 4 Astartes. Cuthhelm felt the surge of dread from the chaplain. He looked to the distant glimmer of metal on the causeway, then remembered his friend. "Toonbald!" He shouted and sprinted off toward the long road beyond. Wulfgar watched the librarian run. All he had left to send was one psyker. He had doomed his chapter, and perhaps his homeworld, through a single misjudged card. Far off, the Necron skimmers surged toward the top of the road. The troops along the parapets fought on, unaware. The Necrons had never been the fools he took them for.